They came to Missouri to build Zion and ended up fighting to survive. They believed they were building a sacred future, but their growing numbers began to look like a threat. Then one election turned fear into violence. And suddenly, the question wasn't who would control Missouri, but whether the Mormons would survive it. By the late 1830s, Missouri had become the heart of the Latter-day Saint movement, drawing thousands who believed they were helping build Zion. But their rapid growth, political unity, religious claims to the region, and expansion into surrounding settlements alarmed many Missourians. After earlier violence forced the Saints from Jackson County, Missouri created Caldwell County as a place for them to settle. For a time, separation seemed to offer peace. But the Mormon population continued to grow, far west expanded, and tensions over land, politics, and power returned. The compromise was collapsing, and by 1838, Missouri was moving toward open violence. Chapter 1. They came to build Zion. The problem began long before the first shots of 1838. Missouri was becoming a destination for thousands of Latter-day Saints. Families arrived from different parts of the United States. They brought belongings, businesses, religious convictions, and the expectation that their lives were now tied to the future of the Mormon movement. They arrived from different parts of the United States, bringing families, businesses, religious convictions, and a shared belief that they were helping establish Zion. That shared belief gave the settlements an unusual sense of purpose. For people who had already sacrificed to leave their previous homes, building a new community was not simply an economic project. It was part of their faith. That unity made the community powerful. It also made outsiders nervous. On the Missouri frontier, population could quickly become political power. In frontier politics, numbers mattered. So did voting. County offices mattered. Local courts mattered. Militia organizations mattered. And control of those institutions could shape who felt secure in a rapidly changing community. Some non-Mormon settlers feared that the growing Mormon population would act as a unified political bloc and eventually control local elections. The fear was not entirely imaginary. Latter-day Saints often shared political interests and commonly supported candidates they believed would protect their community. But the growing political influence was only one source of anxiety. Population growth itself was changing the balance of entire settlements. A group that had once appeared temporary was beginning to look permanent, and a community that had once seemed small was becoming impossible to ignore. But politics was only part of the problem. Land was another. As Mormon settlements expanded beyond Caldwell County, their neighbors increasingly saw the growth as a threat to the balance of power in the region. Land meant farms. It meant homes. It meant economic opportunity. And it meant influence over the future of a county. For Missourians who already lived there, rapid migration could feel like the ground beneath their community was shifting. The more the Mormon population expanded, the harder it became to separate questions of land from questions of power. The old compromise was supposed to contain the conflict. Instead, the population boom was making containment impossible. And beneath all of it was a deeper cultural divide. The Latter-day Saints believed they were building a religious community with a divine purpose. Their concept of Zion gave the migration a meaning that outsiders did not necessarily share. To believers, settling together could strengthen their religious life. To opponents, the same concentration of people could look like the formation of a separate political and social bloc. Many of their neighbors saw a rapidly growing group that seemed unwilling to blend into the existing political and social order. There were also tensions over slavery and sectional politics. Missouri was a slave state, while many Latter-day Saint migrants came from northern states. That difference added another layer of suspicion, particularly in a period when American arguments over slavery were becoming increasingly volatile. The issue was not the only cause of the Missouri conflict, but it contributed to the atmosphere of distrust surrounding the Mormon migration. Missouri was no longer dealing with a small religious settlement. It was dealing with a movement. And movements become dangerous to established power when people believe they can no longer be controlled. Then came the election that turned political fear into physical violence. Chapter 2. When an election became a battlefield. On August 6, 1838, voters gathered in Gallatin, Missouri. The election took place in Daviess County, an area where tensions between Mormon and non-Mormon residents had already been rising. What should have been an ordinary election became a confrontation. At the polling place, tensions erupted between Mormon and non-Mormon residents. The immediate dispute centered on whether Latter-day Saints would be allowed to vote. Arguments became a fight, and the fight became one of the defining moments of the conflict. The violence revealed how fragile political life had become. A ballot was no longer simply a ballot. It represented who would have a voice in the community. The incident also reinforced the fears already spreading on both sides. The message was now clear. Political disagreement had crossed into physical violence. But the election riot did not create the conflict by itself. It exposed something that had been building for years. Both sides increasingly believed the other was preparing to take control of the region. Mormon settlers feared attacks from local vigilantes. They had already been expelled from Jackson County years earlier, so memories of earlier violence remained part of how many Latter-day Saints understood the new crisis. Non-Mormon settlers feared that Mormon numbers, organization, and political unity would overwhelm them. Each side increasingly interpreted the other's actions through the expectation of future conflict. And once people begin preparing for an enemy, even defensive actions can look like preparations for attack. Weapons could be carried for protection. Militia could be mobilized for security. But to the opposing side, those same actions could look like preparation for an assault. The cycle accelerated. Mormon and non-Mormon armed groups began moving through the countryside. Homes and property were attacked. Families were driven from their communities. The violence was no longer confined to one town or one election. It was spreading across the region. And within the Mormon community, some men organized themselves into militant groups, including the group commonly known as the Danites. The Danites were associated with efforts to defend the Mormon community and intimidate perceived enemies. Their exact organization and relationship to senior church leadership remain subjects of historical discussion, but their appearance reflected the increasingly militant atmosphere of 1838. Their existence reflected how far the atmosphere had deteriorated. The conflict was no longer simply about whether two communities could live beside one another. It was becoming a struggle over who would control the region. And once armed groups began moving through the countryside, the distinction between local violence and state authority was becoming dangerously thin. Then, in October, a Mormon force encountered a Missouri militia unit. And this time, the confrontation would involve the state itself. Historical records sometimes differ in detail, but the core events of the Missouri conflict are widely documented. Chapter 3: The moment the state entered the war. On October 25, 1838, armed Mormons confronted a Missouri militia unit at Crooked River. The encounter came during a period of rapidly escalating violence. Missouri militia forces were operating in the region, while Mormon groups were also moving through the countryside. The Mormon force believed it was confronting an anti-Mormon group and moved to rescue fellow church members who had been detained. But the men they encountered were state militia. That distinction would have enormous consequences. A confrontation with local vigilantes could be understood as another episode in a widening frontier conflict. A confrontation with state militia could be treated as an attack on the authority of Missouri itself. The confrontation became a battle. Several men were killed, including David W. Patton, a Mormon apostle. A Missouri militiaman was also killed. For the people involved, these were not abstract casualties in a political dispute. They were members of their communities. Their deaths made further retaliation more likely. That single clash changed the stakes. Until then, the violence had largely been a struggle between local communities, vigilantes, and armed groups. Now a state-authorized military force had been attacked. To Missouri's leaders, this could be interpreted as open resistance to state authority. Governor Lilburn W. Boggs responded by calling for a much larger military response. Thousands of Missouri militia members were mobilized as the state prepared to confront the Mormon settlements. The pressure moved toward Far West. For the Latter-day Saints gathered there, the approaching troops were no longer simply another armed group. They represented the power of the state. Troops moved toward the Mormon stronghold at Far West. The settlement became increasingly surrounded by military force. Then, on October 27th, Boggs issued the order that would forever define the conflict. He declared that the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. The order became known as the Extermination Order. Its wording was extraordinary. A governor had effectively made the expulsion of an entire religious population a matter of state policy. The order did not simply target a handful of armed participants. It demanded the removal of the Mormon population from Missouri for thousands of ordinary families that transformed the question from whether they could defend their homes into whether they could remain in the state at all. But the order did not end the violence. It made the situation even more dangerous. Because while Missouri forces were closing in on far west, another Mormon community was about to be attacked. Chapter 4: The Order That Drove Them Out. On October 30th, 1838, armed men attacked the Mormon settlement at Hans Mill. The settlement was small. Its residents had little warning. The community had no large defensive force capable of confronting the attackers. Many of the settlers were gathered around the blacksmith shop when the attack began. The attackers opened fire on men and boys gathered near a blacksmith shop before withdrawing. The sudden assault left families scrambling for safety. Men tried to reach cover. Wounded survivors were left behind. The violence was over quickly, but its consequences would remain with the community long after the attackers had gone. 18 Mormon men and boys were killed. Others were wounded. The massacre became one of the most remembered atrocities of the Missouri conflict. But Hans Mill was only part of the final collapse. At Far West, thousands of Latter-day Saints were surrounded by Missouri militia. The settlement was now facing overwhelming military pressure. Families could see armed troops around their community. Church leaders knew that Governor Boggs had ordered the Mormon population out of the state. The possibility of continued resistance carried the risk of even greater bloodshed. The situation had become impossible to sustain. The church leadership faced overwhelming military pressure. The choices were narrowing. Resistance could bring more fighting. Remaining in place could bring further arrests and violence. And surrender offered the possibility of ending the immediate military confrontation. On November 1st, Joseph Smith and other leaders surrendered to state forces. Smith was arrested and eventually imprisoned while Missouri authorities pursued charges against him and other leaders. The Mormon community was left facing the consequences of the conflict. Their homes were threatened. Their property was lost or abandoned. Families who had spent years building farms and communities now faced the prospect of leaving them behind. And the state had made its position unmistakable. They had to leave Missouri. Over the following months, thousands of Latter-day Saints crossed the Mississippi River into Illinois. They traveled during winter, often under difficult conditions and with limited resources. Some left with wagons and whatever possessions they could carry. Others had already lost homes, livestock, or property during the conflict. Many left knowing they would probably never recover what they had built in Missouri. They had come to Missouri believing they were building Zion. Now they were refugees. The political fears, religious divisions, retaliatory violence, and failures of leadership had produced a result that few could have imagined when the migration began. A community that had entered Missouri with confidence in its future was now scattered across the border. Missouri had not simply rejected a religious movement. It had forced thousands of people from their homes, and the consequences would follow both sides for generations. Closing reflection. The Missouri conflict shows how quickly fear can transform a disagreement into a struggle for survival. At the beginning, the conflict was not a single battle waiting to happen. It was a series of smaller fears and disputes. Population, land, political power, religious identity, trust. Then each confrontation made the next one easier to imagine. When one community believes another is taking too much power, every new arrival can look like a threat. When political opponents become enemies, an election can become a battlefield. And when violence is answered with more violence, each side can begin believing that retaliation is necessary for protection. That is how conflicts grow, not always because everyone wants war, but because fear changes what people believe they must do to survive. In Missouri, that cycle ended with homes abandoned, families displaced, lives lost, and a government order that was so extreme it remained a stain on the state's history long after the conflict itself had ended. The people who believed Missouri would become Zion were forced to leave, and the state that drove them out would eventually have to confront what had happened in its name. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to Mode Hub Tales as we uncover the forgotten histories, hidden cultures, and untold stories that shaped our world. Because history doesn't disappear, it waits to be remembered.